In the final days of the Third Reich, deep beneath the crumbling ruins of Berlin, history was not only written, it was typed. Her name was Traudl Junge, the young woman who sat beside Adolf Hitler as the world burned above them. She wasn't a soldier nor a spy, just a secretary. But the words she typed shaped the fate of millions. She entered the bunker as a loyal worker and left it carrying the unbearable silence of guilt. This is not a story of battlefields or armies. It is the story of how evil hides behind obedience, and how one woman's silence became a mirror for the conscience of the world. You are watching War Beyond Boundaries, where the forgotten voices of history speak again. Subscribe now and journey deeper into the truths that war tried to bury. April 1945. Deep beneath the ruins of Berlin, the world's most feared dictator sat surrounded by concrete walls, the thunder of Soviet artillery echoing overhead. The bunker reeked of smoke, fear, and the end of an empire. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. Those within knew the Reich was collapsing, but no one dared speak it aloud. And there, in the shadows of history, sat a 22-year-old woman with her typewriter. Her name was Traudl Junge. She was Hitler's personal secretary, the young woman who typed his final words as the Third Reich crumbled around him. She sat just meters away from the man who had ordered the deaths of millions. Yet for decades, her story remained untold. What did she see? What did she hear in those final days when the world outside was burning and the man inside was preparing to take his last breath? At first glance, she was just a girl caught in history's storm, bright-eyed, naive, and eager for work. But the documents she typed, the conversations she overheard, the chilling moments she witnessed, tied her fate to one of the darkest chapters humanity has ever known. And while Hitler's voice would soon fall silent forever, hers would carry a secret, buried for decades. This is the truth she carried. The truth the world was never meant to hear. And it begins here, in the final days of the bunker, with a young secretary who became the silent witness to history's greatest evil. She was born Gertraud Humps in Munich in 1920, the daughter of a master brewer. Her childhood was not marked by privilege or political intrigue, but by ordinary dreams. As a young girl, she imagined herself on a stage, twirling in soft shoes, the applause of strangers rising like music in her ears. She wanted to be a dancer. She wanted grace, beauty, and a life touched by art. But Germany in the 1930s was no place for such delicate dreams. The world around her hardened. Opportunities closed one by one. Her country was changing, consumed by an ideology that demanded obedience rather than imagination. By her early 20s, Traudl, now going by her married name, Junge, found herself searching for work. She was not politically driven, nor deeply interested in the growing cult of the Führer. She was simply young, ambitious in her own quiet way, and desperate for stability. The opportunity arrived not in a theatre, but through an advertisement for secretarial positions. It promised good pay, security, and the possibility of advancement. She applied. She could not have known that this simple decision would bring her face to face with Adolf Hitler. The so-called interview was unlike any she had imagined. It was 1942, and the war had reached its peak. She was escorted into a room where the Führer himself was waiting. Not a cold bureaucrat or a panel of officials. Hitler. To her surprise, he was courteous, even gentle in manner. His voice, often heard screaming in broadcasts and rallies, was quiet here. He asked about her family, her interests, her typing speed. He even smiled at her. There was something unsettling about that smile, almost fatherly, but in its warmth lay the shadow of manipulation. For a girl of just 22, it was disarming. This was the man her country revered, the man whose image stared from posters on every corner. And now he stood before her, extending kindness as though he were nothing more than a patient employer. "You are very young," he told her, his tone soft. "That is good. Youth is what Germany needs." The weight of the moment struck her. She wasn't thinking of concentration camps, of war crimes, of the millions who were suffering under his rule. How could she? None of that was in the room with her. What she saw was power cloaked in civility, authority softened with charm. She thought she had found not just employment, but a place of importance. From that day forward, she was no longer Gertrude Humps the dancer. She became Traudl Junge, secretary to Adolf Hitler. She was ushered into a world of constant activity. Dictations that stretched late into the night, official documents that carried the weight of empires, and words that would shape the fate of nations. Her typewriter became an extension of her hands, clicking faithfully as Hitler paced behind her, speaking in long, obsessive bursts. In those early months, she convinced herself she was simply doing her job, typing letters, recording speeches, transcribing his ideas. The reality that she was helping to create history's darkest orders was too distant, too unimaginable for her to grasp. She told herself she was not involved. She told herself she was just an observer. But she was closer than most generals, closer than the ministers and officers who orbited the Führer's world. She heard his rants when no cameras were present, his small talk at mealtimes, his complaints and his insecurities. She saw the human side of a man history remembers only as a monster. And in that duality, in that terrible gap between the charming employer and the architect of genocide, her innocence began to wither. For now, though she believed she had been chosen for something special, that proximity to greatness was a kind of honor. She did not yet realize that every page she typed carried invisible blood. Every line of text she set to paper would ripple far beyond the walls of the Reich Chancellery. She was not just recording history. She was helping to write it. She thought she was simply typing letters. But she was binding herself to a man who would plunge the world into fire. And soon, the world outside would begin to close in, and her typewriter would carry the weight of words that would seal the fate of millions. Life inside Hitler's inner circle was not what the outside world imagined. The Führer's offices in the Reich Chancellery were not just command posts. They were like a strange, isolated household sealed from reality. It was a world of ticking clocks, polished boots, and whispered commands. Days began early and ended deep into the night. His secretaries, including Traudl Junge, became part of a rigid routine, typing endless dictations, recording speeches, and handling correspondence that would often vanish into the chain of command, carrying orders that shaped the war. Each morning, Junge would arrive in the long marble corridors, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the faint scent of disinfectant. Guards stood motionless at the doors, their eyes cold, their presence constant. Once she entered the private quarters, everything changed. Hitler's voice could already be heard, calm, deliberate, as he discussed troop movements or supply shortages with his generals. But when he turned toward his secretaries, the atmosphere softened, almost absurdly. He would greet them with a nod, or even a small smile, his tone gentle, polite. He was strangely careful with them. He never raised his voice in their presence, never swore, never allowed profanity. "My ladies," he would call them, as though they were guests in a salon rather than witnesses to a war. During meals, he often invited them to join his table. There the mask of the dictator slipped, revealing something far more unsettling. A man who seemed ordinary, even kind. He spoke about art, dogs, and his favorite films. He told jokes, some dry, some surprisingly childish. He teased his adjutants, scolded them about eating meat, and always insisted on sharing vegetarian dishes prepared by his cook. For a moment, it could feel like a dinner among friends. But beneath the laughter there was a tension, a suffocating awareness that no one could truly relax. Every person at that table knew that a single misplaced word could destroy them. Junge noticed how the officers around him laughed a little too loudly, how even the most trivial comments were met with careful agreement. Devotion was expected, fear enforced it. At night, when the secretaries returned to their small rooms, the weight of what they were part of began to sink in. Junge could hear snippets of conversation from the war room, the low hum of panic barely contained by formality. Reports from the front grew darker each week. Entire divisions were vanishing. Cities were burning. The war Hitler spoke of as already won was slipping away. And yet he never admitted it. During dictations, as Junge's typewriter clattered through speeches and proclamations, he still spoke of destiny, of victory, of the unbreakable will of the German people. His faith in his own myth was absolute. Junge began to notice how reality bent around him. The generals who entered with grim news left with hollow promises. His voice, calm and mesmerizing, seemed to rewrite the truth in real time. Sometimes, when she looked up from the typewriter, she saw his face in profile, pale, tense, illuminated by the yellow light of the desk lamp. His fingers trembled slightly, his eyes darting as though chasing thoughts faster than his words could capture them. There were moments when she pitied him, seeing only an exhausted old man trapped by his own delusions. But then, the next morning, she would type new orders, directives that meant the deaths of thousands, and the pity would curdle into unease. Among the secretaries, an unspoken bond formed. They called themselves his girls, a title that brought both pride and shame. They were young, carefully chosen, loyal by necessity. They celebrated birthdays together, shared chocolates, and whispered about the war they were never allowed to question. But even among themselves, there were limits to what could be said. The walls had ears, and when the Führer's mood darkened, everyone felt it. Junge once recalled how he could be warm one moment and icy the next, his temper flaring when reality contradicted his fantasies. He could spend hours lecturing about the future of humanity, the purity of the German race, or the betrayal of his enemies. His monologues went on long after midnight, and the secretaries would sit silently, nodding when appropriate, too afraid to show fatigue. He would look at them as though seeking validation, approval, even affection. That was the strangest part. He needed them. There was a kind of intimacy in those nights that Junge could never explain. Hitler treated her almost like a daughter, offering advice, complimenting her handwriting, asking about her mother. She knew that millions were dying outside the walls, but inside he created a distorted reality of calm and civility. He told her once that he hated cruelty, that he could not stand the sight of blood. Junge did not know how to respond. The contradiction was unbearable. By 1944, the cracks in the illusion were impossible to ignore. The Allies were advancing. The once grand halls of the Chancellery trembled under air raids. Junge began to feel the suffocation of her proximity to power, the way it consumed everything it touched. She was closer to Hitler than most generals, closer than ministers, even closer than his family. She saw the man stripped of the public mask, the insomnia, the paranoia, the trembling hands that betrayed his failing health, but that closeness came at a cost. The deeper she was drawn into his private world, the harder it became to separate her duty from her conscience. Each day she wrote words that glorified him. Each night she felt a quiet dread grow heavier in her chest. The laughter at dinner, no longer sounded human. It was the echo of people pretending, people trapped in devotion and denial. Sometimes she wondered what would happen when it all ended. What would become of them when the myth shattered and the truth emerged? In those moments, she looked at the documents she had typed, the speeches, the decrees, the lies, and felt the chill of complicity creep over her. She was still young, still hopeful in some fragile way, but something inside her had begun to die. She had entered this world thinking she was simply recording history. Now she realized she was helping to build a cage, one that none of them would escape. And soon that cage would move underground. The walls would close in, and the man she had served so faithfully would decide that if he could not rule the world, he would burn it with him. By early 1945, Berlin was no longer a city. It was a graveyard of collapsing stone and burning steel. The once mighty capital of the Reich had become a wasteland. Fires raged through the streets, smoke blackened the sky, and the thunder of Soviet artillery rolled closer each day, shaking the ground beneath every survivor's feet. The air reeked of dust, fear, and gasoline. For Traudl Junge, this was the world she descended into, the final stage of a nightmare that had begun 3 years earlier with a job interview. The bunker lay beneath the Reich Chancellery, a maze of concrete corridors sealed deep underground. It was meant to be a shelter, but to Junge it felt more like a tomb. She arrived there in January 1945, when the walls of Berlin were already trembling under the Red Army's advance. The descent down the narrow staircase was suffocating. The deeper she went, the heavier the air became. The lights flickered, the ceilings dripped with condensation, and the echo of footsteps carried the weight of dread. Inside, time lost all meaning. The bunker ran on Hitler's schedule, not the clock's. He rose late in the morning, held meetings in the afternoon, and dined long after midnight. Outside, the world was collapsing, but inside, the routine continued. Letters to dictate, reports to read, and speeches to type. Junge and the other secretaries worked in shifts, the sound of their typewriters blending with the muffled explosions above. Each night the air raids grew louder. Dust shook from the ceiling as bombs struck nearby buildings. They could hear the ground itself moaning, the city screaming in its death throes. The corridors filled with soldiers, adjutants, doctors, and loyal followers, all pretending that victory was still possible. But even the most devoted could feel the truth pressing in. Hitler's once commanding voice had become brittle, his temper unpredictable. His hands trembled constantly now, his movements slow, his eyes glassy. The man who once held nations in terror was reduced to pacing the bunker hallways, muttering to himself, trapped in his own fantasy. Junge's role was unchanged. She typed, she transcribed, she watched. Every day she sat only a few meters from him as he dictated messages to phantom divisions and imaginary generals. He still believed, or pretended to believe, that salvation would come at the last moment. When news arrived that the Soviets had surrounded the city, he called it a temporary setback. Junge listened in silence, fingers moving over the keys, each word feeling heavier than the last. Then came April 29th. The bunker was suffocating with tension. Eva Braun, who had lived in Hitler's shadow for years, decided to marry him. Junge was among those who witnessed the hurried ceremony, conducted in a small, dimly lit room. The mood was surreal, a wedding in hell. The bride smiled faintly, her face pale beneath the harsh electric light. Hitler looked weary, almost detached, as if performing a final duty before the end. Champagne was poured, and for a fleeting hour there was laughter. But it was hollow, fragile, a desperate attempt to deny the inevitable. That same night, Hitler summoned Junge to the study. His voice was calm, almost gentle. He told her he needed to dictate his final will and political testament. She sat at her typewriter as he spoke, his words steady but devoid of life. He declared his undying faith in the German people, blamed his generals for betrayal, and cursed the Jews for everything that had gone wrong. Junge typed each sentence mechanically, trying not to think, not to feel. She realized then that she was transcribing not just a document, but the end of an era. When the last page was finished, he signed it with a trembling hand. Junge glanced up and saw something she would never forget, his expression, not of anger or despair, but relief. The act of sealing his own fate seemed to bring him peace. He handed her the pages without a word, and she left the room in silence, the echo of her footsteps loud in the narrow corridor. The next morning, April 30th, was quiet. Too quiet. The bombing had subsided briefly, replaced by an eerie stillness. In the corridor outside Hitler's quarters, the staff moved like ghosts. Junge saw Eva Braun for the last time, smiling faintly as she walked past, her blue dress pressed neatly, her hair perfectly done. She looked calm, unnaturally calm. Junge's hands trembled as she gathered papers on her desk. Then sometime after lunch, the door to Hitler's study closed. No one was allowed in. Minutes stretched into eternity. A faint smell of gunpowder seeped through the corridor. The silence broke with a single sharp sound. A gunshot. Then nothing, not even footsteps. Junge froze. She didn't scream, didn't move. Somewhere down the hall, someone gasped. Others stood motionless, as if afraid to breathe. Moments later, Hitler's adjutant opened the door. The Führer was slumped on the sofa, a pistol still in his hand. Eva Braun lay beside him, her body still, her lips faintly blue. The smell of cyanide hung in the air. No one spoke. No one cried. It was as if the entire bunker exhaled at once, the tension of years collapsing in a single breath. Junge stood in the hallway, her body numb. She had typed his last words, heard his last voice, and now she was one of the first to know that the man who had dominated her world and destroyed millions of others was dead. Outside, the war thundered on, indifferent to the end of its architect. Inside, the bunker fell into stunned silence. Some began to pray, others to drink. The illusion of loyalty dissolved into panic. Junge sat alone in her small room, her typewriter silent for the first time in years. She felt no triumph, no sorrow, only emptiness. The man who had ruled nations with fear was gone, but his shadow remained, pressed into every page she had ever typed. She could still hear the faint echo of that gunshot, the sound that marked not just the end of a life, but the moment when history itself seemed to hold its breath. She was one of the last people to see Adolf Hitler alive, and one of the first to know he was dead. But for Traudl Junge, the war was not over. The walls of the bunker still stood, and the question that haunted her now was not what she had witnessed, but how she would ever live with it. The air in the bunker grew heavier after Hitler's death. The walls seemed to close in, as though the concrete itself had absorbed the despair of everyone inside. The gunshot had silenced the man they had served for years, but it did not bring freedom, only confusion and fear. Outside, the city was falling apart. The Soviets were closing in on every street, and the sounds of tanks and artillery rumbled like distant thunder. Traudl Junge knew that if she stayed, she would be captured or worse. There was no ceremony, no farewell. Just a whispered decision made in the half-light of the corridor. Junge and a small group of staff, other secretaries, soldiers, doctors, would try to escape the bunker and disappear into the chaos above. They had no plan, no map, and no guarantees, only desperation. On May 1st, 1945, they left the safety of the underground shelter for the burning city above. The air was thick with ash, and the streets were unrecognizable. Once grand boulevards were now rivers of rubble. Fires raged in every direction. Dead soldiers and civilians lay motionless along the sidewalks, and the constant whine of distant gunfire followed them wherever they went. Junge wore a plain coat and wrapped her hair under a scarf, hoping to blend in with the civilians fleeing through the ruins. Each step through the shattered city felt like walking through a dream. Berlin, the city that had once celebrated the marches and parades of victory, was now nothing but ruin. She passed mothers clutching children, soldiers wandering aimlessly, and old men searching for shelter. No one looked at her twice. No one cared who she was. In that anonymity, she felt a strange kind of safety, but escape was not easy. Soviet troops were everywhere, searching, questioning, dragging out those they believed to be Nazi officials. Junge's group moved mostly at night, sleeping in basements or abandoned apartments. Food was scarce, water even more so. Every sound of boots in the distance sent their hearts racing. They whispered to each other in the dark, wondering if they would be shot on sight if discovered. Then, one cold morning, their luck ran out. They were stopped by a group of Soviet soldiers on a half-collapsed street. Guns were raised. "Junge Frotze!" The officer shouted something in Russian, and one of her companions tried to respond, claiming they were civilians. The Soviets weren't convinced. They were taken to an interrogation point, a ruined school building turned into a temporary command post. For hours, Junge sat under the harsh glare of a single bulb. The questions came fast and sharp. Who was she? What was her position? Did she know Hitler personally? Each time she lied, her voice trembled. She told them she had been a typist, nothing more. Just an office worker caught in the chaos of war. The officers stared at her for a long time, their expressions unreadable. Finally, one of them waved her away, muttering in broken German that she was no one important. It was over. Just like that. She was free, or so she thought. Junge wandered through the wreckage of post-war Germany like a ghost. The world around her was rebuilding, but she lived in the shadow of something no one could see. She found work again as a secretary, her name unknown, her past unspoken. She rented small rooms, kept to herself, and learned the art of silence. To her neighbors, she was just another woman trying to survive in the ruins of defeat. But at night, when the world quieted, the memories returned, the sound of the typewriter, the laughter at dinner, the gunshot echoing through the bunker's concrete halls. She told herself she had only done her job, that she hadn't known the truth. Yet the guilt lingered like a sickness she couldn't name. She remembered Hitler's soft voice when he spoke to her, the way he had smiled, the way he had made her feel seen, and she felt disgusted by her own memory. How could she have been so blind? How could she have stood beside a monster and seen only a man? Years passed, and the war became history. Books were written, trials were held, names were remembered and condemned. Junge kept silent through it all. She watched from a distance as others from Hitler's circle were arrested or executed. Some defended themselves with defiance. Others begged for forgiveness. She did neither. She said nothing. It was easier to disappear, to hide behind the face of an ordinary woman. But no matter how much she tried, the past clung to her. Every time she heard the word Hitler, her stomach tightened. Every time she saw photographs of the camps, of the millions who had suffered, she felt a wave of nausea and shame. In private moments, she began to write small notes, fragments of memory, not confessions exactly, but questions. She wrote about the first day she met him, about his strange gentleness, about the illusion she had lived inside. She wrote about the day he died, and the silence that followed. Each line felt like a wound opening. Was she innocent or complicit? It was a question she couldn't answer. She had never given an order, never fired a weapon. And yet she had typed the words that justified it all. She had helped make his thoughts permanent. Her hands had given shape to his final lies. The world saw her as one of many secretaries, an insignificant figure lost in history's machinery. But Junge knew better. She had been too close to evil, too close to power, too close to the man whose voice had commanded the death of millions. In that closeness, something inside her had broken, and for the rest of her life, she would carry that silence like a sentence, unspoken, invisible but impossible to escape. For decades, Traudl Junge lived behind a quiet facade, an ordinary woman in post-war Germany, invisible in the crowd. She never spoke of the bunker, never mentioned Hitler's name aloud. To her friends and co-workers, she was polite, reserved, and vague about her past. The war had ended long ago, but for Junge, it had never really stopped. It lived inside her, in every keystroke of memory, every moment she dared to remember the man whose words she had once typed. Time had dulled the world's wounds, but it had not erased them. The horrors of the Holocaust were now history lessons, films, memorials. Generations had grown up asking, how could this have happened? And somewhere in the shadows, the woman who had sat beside Hitler as he dictated his final words carried her own unanswered question. How could I not have known? It wasn't until the late 1990s, more than 50 years after the war, that Traudl Junge began to speak publicly. She was old now, her hair silver, her hands fragile, but her voice, though soft, still carried the precision of the secretary she had once been. For years, she had refused interviews, but as she neared the end of her life, silence began to feel like a kind of cowardice. The truth, she decided, could no longer remain unspoken. When the cameras were turned on her for the first time, she didn't try to defend herself. She didn't ask for sympathy. Instead, she confessed to something deeper, not guilt of action, but guilt of blindness. Her words trembled, but they were clear. I was 22, and I didn't see the monster behind the man until it was too late. It was a sentence that pierced the world's conscience. In that one line, Junge captured the terrible paradox of ordinary complicity, how evil can hide behind charm, discipline, and power until it becomes invisible to those who serve it. She spoke of the first time she met Hitler, how kind and almost fatherly he had seemed. She remembered the warmth of his voice, the care he showed for his staff, the way he asked about her family. It was that humanity, false and manipulative as it was, that had blinded her. "He never shouted," she said. "He was polite, even gentle. I thought I was lucky to work for such a man." Then, as the years went on, she realized that the words she had typed were not just letters or speeches. They were instruments of death. "When I saw the films of the camps after the war," Junge said, "I felt as though my hands were stained. I had helped record his lies. I had helped history destroy itself." The interviews grew more emotional with each session. Junge wept as she recalled the bunker, the quiet dread of those final days, the way Hitler had thanked her for her loyalty before retreating into his private room for the last time. "I didn't cry when he died," she admitted. "Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't understand. I was too naive, too small to grasp the world that was collapsing around me." The world listened in stunned silence. Some saw her as a woman finally confronting the truth. Others saw her as too late, as a participant who had the luxury of remorse after the fact. But Junge didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't claim ignorance as an excuse. Instead, she offered her story as a warning. "I should have questioned more," she said. "I should have known. Youth is no excuse." One of the most haunting moments came near the end of her life, in the 2002 documentary Blind Spot, Hitler's secretary. Sitting beneath the harsh lights, her eyes glistened as she spoke her final reflection. "When I learned about Sophie Scholl, the same age as I was, executed for resisting Hitler, I realized that being young was no excuse. If she could see the truth, why couldn't I?" That admission, raw, unguarded, and filled with regret, transformed her from a historical footnote into a moral mirror. Viewers didn't know whether to pity her or condemn her. Was she a victim of manipulation or a silent accomplice to evil? Junge never answered that question herself. Perhaps she couldn't. "I will carry this guilt," she said softly in one of her final interviews. "Not because I committed crimes, but because I failed to see them." Her confession was not redemption. It was revelation. It forced the world to look again at the grey spaces in history, at the people who were neither monsters nor heroes, but something in between. When Traudl Junge died in 2002, the same night the documentary premiered in Berlin, many said her story had finally come full circle. After decades of silence, she had spoken. And in doing so, she had forced the world to confront a terrible truth, that evil does not always appear in the face of a monster. Sometimes it smiles kindly, speaks gently, and asks you to take dictation. And sometimes, as Junge learned too late, you realize that by the time you see the monster, your hands are already part of his story. When Traudl Junge passed away in February 2002, the world barely noticed at first. Her name had been buried beneath decades of silence, known only to historians and a few who remembered the faces in the Führer's bunker. But that same night across Berlin, the documentary Blind Spot, Hitler's secretary, premiered, and suddenly, her voice, long muted by fear and guilt, spoke once more. On the screen, an elderly woman sat before the camera, her face worn by time, her eyes heavy with memory. There were no theatrics, no rehearsed speeches, only honesty, trembling and raw. For the first time, the world heard her tell the story that she had carried for half a century. She spoke of youth, blindness, and the quiet terror of realizing that obedience can destroy more than disobedience ever could. Her words were not a plea for forgiveness, but a warning, a desperate attempt to make sense of a life lived too close to evil. "I was not a Nazi," she said softly, "but I belonged to a world that allowed Nazism to exist. That is my guilt." Those who watched the film were struck not by her attempt to absolve herself, but by her refusal to do so. She did not justify. She confessed. And in that confession, she revealed a truth far more haunting than hatred itself, that indifference can be its own form of complicity. In the final moments of her life story, Junge's reflection carried an almost unbearable weight. She had lived an ordinary existence after the war, anonymous jobs, quiet apartments, fading into history, but her final message ensured she would never truly disappear. "I have learned," she said, "that the worst evil is not always loud. Sometimes it hides in silence." Her testimony struck a chord across generations. Historians, survivors, and young viewers alike felt the chill of recognition. The lesson was not about her alone, but about everyone, the reminder that history's horrors were not only built by tyrants, but by thousands who obeyed, followed, or simply looked away. In the end, Traudl Junge was not a monster nor a hero. She was something far more unsettling, a reflection of the ordinary human being caught in the machinery of evil. Her life stood as a mirror to the dangers of obedience without question, of duty without conscience, and so her story lingers, not as redemption, but as remembrance. A voice from the shadows of history whispering a warning that still echoes today. Even those who never commit evil can help it flourish through silence. Because sometimes the greatest crime of all is not what we do, but what we choose not to see.